This is one of the first times I've been able to stream myself while being on here. Awesome. This is one of the first times I've been able to stream myself while.
How is that happening?
It's me streaming myself without muting.
Okay. I was like, at least it's not an echo. The kind of playback is cute. It's like you're talking to yourself. Giving yourself a
Yeah, it
little
was weird. It was weird.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, we ready to go? Sorry, I muted for that quick second while we were doing that. Okay, cool. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Matter Monday, a weekly talk show where we're exploring the news industry. For those of you who are familiar with our show and have been here before, welcome back. We're very glad to see you virtually. And for those of you that are new, welcome. We're very excited to have you here and to dive into different facets of the news industry with you. So tonight, we are following the money just a bit to talk about who funds Columbus's news. So next week, we'll be talking about diversity in the newsroom, and you can catch us here live streaming every Monday at 7 p.m. through the end of the year on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram Live. So throughout the program, we encourage comments and questions, and you can drop in every live feed that we have, or email or DM us if you have something you'd like us to cover on a future episode. So next week, like I said, on November 30th at 7 p.m., we'll be discussing diversity in the news industry. And also, while we're talking about funding the news, this is also a fundraising event for Matter News. And we have a suggested $5 donation, and donations can be made on our website or at the link in bio. This really helps us be able to afford to put on these events and make sure that we've got the technology to do so and keep producing information about the local news industry here in Columbus. So now through December, your donation will be at least doubled as part of our News Match fundraiser, which is really exciting because it allows your donation to just go much further. So any one-time donation is doubled at no cost to you, and any monthly donation, anyone who signs up to be a new sustaining member, your donation is matched all year long at no cost to you. So it really helps those donations go much further by taking advantage of this time to really support our independent nonprofit newsroom here in Columbus. So I'd also like to take a second to thank our sponsors, Night Road Studio and Wild Goose Creative. Night Road Studio, is live streaming all of our events and is a Black-owned multimedia company here in Columbus. So they've been so great and done such a fantastic job of helping us with all of this tech and the back, live streaming these days. There's a lot that goes into it. So they do such a fantastic job in supporting us with that. And Wild Goose Creative, they are an arts nonprofit that is has been sponsoring our space for the event. We've decided to kind of take a remote and virtual approach, just with everything with what's going on with COVID-19. We want to take the precautions to keep everyone as safe as we can. So, but we do appreciate them letting us use that space in the past. We're going to go ahead and get into it. And get started. So first off, I'd love for my two lovely co-hosts here to introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and start with Cassie.
Hi, y'all. I'm Cassie Young. I am a co-founder of Gray Matter Media and Matter News, and currently my role is with our overall organization and nonprofit and getting all of that off the ground, but also engagement. So these events that we're doing, I'm heavily involved in organizing, and just really appreciate you tuning in tonight. And if you have any ideas for future events, please let us know because we love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Cass.
All right, I'll take the second spot here. So I'm Jalen Grisso. I am also one of the co-founders of Gray Matter Media, as well as the editor-in-chief of Matter News. Like all of us do, I wear many hats. One of those hats right now includes marketing. So I'm responsible for getting a lot of marketing and fundraising emails together, as well as kind of overseeing our general editorial process and kind of making sure things keep running.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for introducing yourselves. My name is Marissa Twig. I'm also a Matter News co-founder. I oversee our Develop Us investigation, looking into city development, and also manage our social media. So say hello to either me or Cass. We both manage a lot of that, and so we'd love to hear from you. All right, let's dive into some of these questions here and kind of get talking about the money behind funding local news. So, to kind of start off, let's just get a lay of the land here. What are the different ways in which news is funded, generally?
Well, I can start. So, like a lot of industries, the kind of most basic bare bones of it is that you can be for profit, nonprofit, or public media. Nonprofit and public media tend to get grouped together a lot because they're similar funding models, as in meaning that they're primarily donor driven. So, primarily from donors, grants, but public media also gets some assistance from the government. Whereas nonprofit media does not. We're completely reliant on donations and grants to make ends meet. For-profit media, by and large, gets most of their income and their revenue from advertisements, or from other like earned income kind of areas. And we might get into a little bit more of the details of that later, but that's kind of the broad strokes.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, several different funding choices there. So out of those, how is journalism in Columbus funded? What are some of the ways that you've come across here locally?
For profit, for profit, for profit. By and large, most of the organizations and most of the newsrooms in Columbus are for profit newsrooms. There's a few exceptions. WSU, WCBE are both part of the public media, so they're technically PBS, and do get some funding from government, although I think the vast majority of their funding does come from donors. And then the Free Press is also kind of a nonprofit newsroom. They are technically owned by a nonprofit organization that I think by and large mostly just manages the Free Press. So those are a couple of the like more nonprofit side of things, but by and large the rest of it is all for profit.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. I've been really surprised that there really hasn't been much besides us. There's some real small publications, and some are magazines I tend to see more that are independent, and radio stations, podcast outlets. But in terms of like print news or like just news publications for Columbus, I feel like, yeah, like Jay said, it's mostly for profit or kind of the ones that you've heard of over the years that have been around for a while, which is like the Free Press and some of those. So I've been really surprised that since I had the idea, or we started really getting at trying to solve this issue for Columbus, I think a lot of people really see that issue needs to be solved, but it's also, as we've learned building this, a tall order to try to fill that gap, because it's a huge gap that the industry has.
Absolutely. Speaking of publications that are just popping up, Cassie, what was the name of that publication we just learned about the other day that they're like on their second issue?
The Oracle.
The Oracle, yeah, they're definitely a good one to check out. And I think you're right. I think there's tons of new organizations that are popping up that are really promising. Most of the ones that I'm mentioning that are for profit, and although some of the new ones might be for profit too, but I think there is also something to be said for not just being for profit, but also being independently owned, which I think those two things get lumped together a lot, but are two separate issues. And I think there's definitely something to be said for being independently owned. Most of the for-profit media that I'm talking about is primarily mainstream media. And I'm happy to dive more into like specific ownership of specific companies if we want to have that discussion. But by and large, yeah, they're looking for profits, trying to make sure they make money for their shareholders.
And I want to make sure to shout out that there are so it depends, I think, and I even get in this lane of thinking about like what qualifies as local news. And so I feel like sometimes I don't even think of some of the people who are doing this local work immediately, and we really have to make sure we expand because we are very multimedia. So, for example, Devonte and the Unbossed Network. So he's doing a lot of like more broadcasts. So he's definitely doing local news and politics and movement stuff, broadcasting primarily. He does, different things. And then even so, someone who shot some love to Matter News recently, Mayor Mills, he's someone who has a show, especially with the pandemic. He has a really high quality production show where he interviews local entrepreneurs. It's called New Flava. So check him out. And, so I was talking to him about the fact that he is an economics reporter in a way, like he is making news and producing really high quality news about local businesses. So I think if you really expand the definition of what qualifies as like the local news. I think there actually are a lot of like smaller creators, or people who are just kind of getting started on making their way into the industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to, I want to pull some things out of there. With that, Jalen, you had talked about this gap, and I kind of want to hear from both of you. What you talked about this gap of nonprofit news, I believe, and can you talk about, why is there a gap? What does that gap mean, kind of, for our community, and how nonprofit newsrooms are trying to, what that looks like, what that kind of trend of nonprofit news looks like broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, and I can't remember if it was me that brought it up or Cassie, but part of the reason that we started all of this, like part of the reason that we're here, that Gray Matter Media exists, that Matter exists, all of this, is because we really heavily believed that Columbus needed better local news, and not just that, but specifically nonprofit news. Nonprofit news, and like if you've seen any of our marketing stuff or any of our materials on it, you've seen that we're really big fans of nonprofit news. And it's not just because we're a nonprofit. We chose that pathway specifically because we think it's the most sustainable and the most ethical funding model. And that really didn't exist here in Columbus. Like when I came here as a freelancer, I moved from New York, where I was working, lived in Brooklyn, worked in Manhattan, typical New Yorker stuff. Came out to Columbus and started freelancing. Hi, y'all. Sorry, this is my cat, River. Came out to Columbus and started freelancing. And I was shocked to find that there were like almost no nonprofit newsrooms here. There was one in Ohio that I found fairly easily that covered statewide news, but there was really nothing that covered Columbus specifically. And I had been seeing more and more big cities have these nonprofit newsrooms that were specifically looking at like diving deeper, providing information that was free and accessible to everyone, like a lot of the things that nonprofit news stands for. And that didn't really exist here. And it really shocked me for a city that's like the 14th largest city in the nation, that was like named number 2 most economically segregated. It was like, this seems like a perfect place for nonprofit news to exist. So why doesn't it? And it does now, but it didn't for a long time. And that was part of the reason that we saw that hole, is that like, there is some news and information coming to Columbus, but most of that is behind a paywall or requires a subscription. And even after you get past that paywall or that subscription, it is questionable how much of the news is actually going to be helpful or impactful for your daily life.
Wow, that is brilliant. And can you, so that the source of funding, it sounds like there's a little bit to unpack there. So does the source of funding have an impact on news production? You kind of, you're talking about paywalls and kind of what that looks like. But what kinds of impacts might that be?
Yeah, I can definitely talk on this from the newsroom perspective. And I feel like Cassie might be able to talk about it from a reader perspective, because I feel like she's seen a lot of the effects of it kind of before she even knew that they were necessarily effects of it. From a newsroom perspective, it changes the way that the attitude is for the entire company, for the newsroom, for the way that we think about the news. In a for-profit newsroom, I think there are a lot of journalists that are genuinely thinking about it as doing like a public good, as being like a public servant and doing things like that. But at the end of the day, they're driven by how many stories they have to produce, right? And the number of stories that they have to produce is driven by like how much money they need to make and what the clicks and the views are going to be for their website. So the more money that they can make. And you don't see that deeper dedication to being able to sit with the story for longer, or to be able to dive in deeper, or even to like think of yourself as a public servant, almost in the way that you would expect like a government agency to feel, right? Nonprofit newsrooms have that feeling more. It feels like less of a rat race. It feels like less of like egotistically wanting to get your byline on stories. It feels much more like genuinely trying to do something for the community. Of course, I'm going to paint it as like a very rosy picture because I love nonprofit news, and I think the newsrooms I've worked for have really fulfilled that mission. But I think it's true. I think it does seep through for any nonprofit newsroom.
I appreciate you teeing me up, because at first I was thinking like, you should answer that question. You really have the experience, which is true, like you said, from the journalist perspective. But you're right that really one of the biggest reasons that I kind of had the realization that I wanted to found a news outlet was because I was involved in community organizing pretty heavily years back. And I felt like a lot of the work we were doing. And even if we did organize a big successful march or whatever it would be, some kind of direct action or campaign, the news not covering those things or the root cause of those things, and you know, educating the people about why there would even be a demonstration in the first place was just completely missing. And I think one of the things that, you know, really gets, it's about priorities. And for us, we've been really, like Jay said from the beginning, I questioned, should we be a nonprofit? And, you know, I had the entrepreneur community in my ear saying, like, if you're thinking about starting a nonprofit, don't. But that's not great advice, because yes, nonprofits can be quote unquote a hassle in certain ways, because you have a board and you have all these legal requirements and things. It can really be a benefit if you're a nonprofit operation, you're a newsroom, you're trying to do something or a service or fulfill a mission that benefits the community. So I think that when it comes to the way we operate, we're really thinking about the community at large when we're making decisions. But we've seen in the local news that that's not true when you're working with certain deadlines, or you have a different kind of funding model that's based on advertisers. Sometimes you can't make decisions like we can. We can make decisions that are going to potentially make our donors happy, that might not make an advertiser happy. So at the Dispatch, when they have to go to print in 10 minutes, they have like a short deadline, and this person has been given a deadline. I don't think, from what I've heard about specific instances, they're so easily able to say, you know, I haven't heard from enough people or the right voices on this story, or I don't have enough of the right research. They just have to hit that deadline. So I think that what the newsroom prioritizes and what the news ends up looking like really is different depending on who's paying for it.
Wow, I really liked what you were talking about there, you know, in terms of, you know, what the interest of a donor looks like and what the interest of an advertiser look like. And a lot of times, I mean, those are two very different things.
Can I bring up one quick thing?
Yeah, please.
Unless that was going to mess up the point you were going to make. I just also, and I glazed over this a bit, and I have not really thought about it this way, but the fact also that we have a board, I think, is a huge benefit for so many reasons. But they're also, you know, we are accountable to them and the board. So I don't know that everyone that's viewing this would know this, but for a nonprofit organization, no matter what you do, whether you're a news organization or you're providing services to people that don't have homes, for example, you have a board legally, you're required to have one, and that board of directors is supposed to make sure that you are acting in line with your mission, that you're spending funds and prioritizing things in line with your mission. And they're supposed to correct you and kind of block what you're doing if you're not doing that, or, you know, they can even usually have control over who runs the organization. So an executive director, so the three of us co-manage Matter News. And as soon as we get our own nonprofit status, we will end up being the type of managing directors that if we step out of line with Matter's mission, we are accountable to our board and they could take action. So there's a whole different kind of ecosystem of decision making when you're a nonprofit.
Yeah. I just want to piggyback on one point of that real fast. Poor Marissa's never going to get to ask the next question. I also think it's really important because, like, a big tenet of journalism is transparency, right? And is that level of accountability, and is being willing to be held accountable, and therefore, like, make the information that you have about your company, your organization, whatever, transparent. It's something that journalists are always hyping on the government to do, and even like private companies to do, is to make their financials transparent and things like that. As a nonprofit newsroom, you have to not only be accountable to your board of directors, but you also have to make certain financial records transparent every single year. That provides a level of accountability, not just to the board, but to the public, for us to say, like, hey, are you actually putting your money where your mouth is? Like, are you actually delivering on the thing that you said you were going to do for us and that donors gave you money for? we can't get away with not because we have to publish that information. We're legally required to. And I think a lot of newsrooms are willing to share that information regardless, but it can be a lot more hit or miss. And like with some of the structures of corporate news anymore, especially with like even some of the places that exist in Columbus, it gets so hidden in corporation under corporation under corporation that you don't even know whose financials to look at to really know whether or not your news station is doing well.
Wow, all of that was really powerful information and really eye-opening. You know, even for me, the way that you've laid it out there is, I mean, it's really interesting to think about the impact that the way ownership affects, you know, the information that we're consuming. Um, so earlier, I was leading into a little bit about donations and talking about how, you know, what you know serving donors versus serving advertisers. And I think that was a really great tie into actually a Pew study that we reference a lot. So Pew, the Pew Research Center, and the Knight Foundation, which is a big journalism funder, among many other things, partnered on a study and found that among elderly, middle-aged, and young folks across the United States, elderly folks are the most likely to pay for news subscriptions, while young people are the most likely to donate to news organizations and pay for sustaining memberships. So, with that kind of fact in mind, you know, what do you think this means for how newsrooms may be funded in the future?
I think it's super exciting for a nonprofit newsroom to see the trends just because, and I think it in ways confirms this data that we're looking at, and we'll make sure we share this data more widely at some point with y'all who are tuning in. Or maybe I'll see if I can drop the study in the chat before we get off. But it's really interesting to look at because there's this thing, and I think Jalen, you talk about this a lot, that it really irks you that the older generations tend to blame younger people for not paying for news. But this data shows that basically like 67% of people 55 and older, I think is what this data says, pay for subscriptions. 55% of people 18 to 34 do. So that's really still a good rate. You know, it's not that much lower than the two generations older than them. And interestingly, the middle generation, which I think is the older millennials, 35 to 54, middle-aged people actually subscribe to subscriptions less than our generation being younger millennials and Gen Z. So really, it's kind of interesting to see that those actual statistics, and then to layer on top of that 55 and older, 20% of them pay for donations for news, but 37% of young people pay for donations for news. So that's showing that, you know, actually, if you compare those two numbers, really young people are making up for the less that they pay for subscriptions with the more that they're paying for donations for news. In a way, I don't know how this all shakes out, you know, dollar wise and stuff like that, but at least in terms of the percentage of people who are, you know, supporting news and paying for news in some form, I think, and I'd have to spend a little bit more time drilling down on this data, but I think that it's saying that young people, and then if you include memberships, which is a different category, young people are the most likely to pay for those. And so if you look at this data, it's almost making me at a first glance think that young people actually pay for more news in aggregate than the generations older than them.
Yeah,
that's really
yeah. That's really fascinating about kind of that 35 to 60, I think you said, range. I feel like that would be Gen X. And I feel like Gen X as a generation is even more disillusioned than like we are. I think that their generation was very disillusioned. And then our generation is like, all right, y'all, we're going to fix this shit. Like, we're going to come in and do some shit to fix it. And I think that makes sense, you know, with the rise of like social for profits, as well as just like more social impact companies across the board. I think it makes sense that a lot of younger folks are like, you know what, I'm not going to pay for a subscription for a bunch of news I don't need, but for news that is specifically serving the public good, that is specifically serving the common good, like, yeah, of course I'll fork up some money for that. Because like I like you were referencing earlier, I've always been frustrated with people being like, oh, you'll pay like whatever it is, $7, $8 for a Netflix subscription per month, but you won't pay $5 for your like local news subscription. It's like, of course they don't. Of course young people don't do that because A, they can get local news on Facebook and tons of other social platforms, and B, it's probably more entertaining. Like it's probably going to keep their attention more. And like, I don't think that shaming folks into paying for those subscriptions is really like a valid model to be sustainable as an industry. I just don't think it is. So I think it is really encouraging to see that younger folks are willing to like, willing to put money where it needs to go, and not necessarily rely on like the systems of capitalism to put money where it needs to go.
And I don't know how many people tuned in right now or tuned in last week, but we really talked a lot about the state of the news industry and just how dire the state of the news industry is. It's like legit becoming extinct, especially when it comes to local news in a lot of markets, including Columbus. I think it's becoming endangered. So it's really important just to note that this is super important in light of that, to note that the overall trend seems to be that actually younger generations are investing more and actually investing in a more like, I don't know, in the nonprofit model, more in kind of diversifying. If you look at their numbers, that really the youngest generation is the one that's kind of diversifying how they're paying for and investing in their news sources. So to be able to save the news industry, as we talked about last week, it's according to the American Journalism Project, going to take $1 billion to $1 billion, I think, is what they think needs to be raised. And so we need every generation to step up and be investing in more news sources. So this is positive trend in terms of that, positive trend in terms of those of us who tend to think nonprofit news is the future of news. Young people are definitely down for the cause, I think.
Excuse me, switching between mute and unmute. So with that really brings me to think about culture and looking at the way newsrooms operate and the way they're structured. We've talked about kind of how, what the different impacts kind of look like, both from a community standpoint, newsroom standpoint. But let's dive into culture a little bit more and kind of talk about what the ownership and the kind of funding source of news does to the culture of a newsroom or can create in that institution, and what those effects are, kind of maybe on the reader or the news that's being produced.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to give the disclaimer, the caveat that everything that I say is from the experiences that I've had in the newsrooms I've had. I haven't necessarily worked in like a local broadcast station that's owned by like Sinclair or Nexstar or Tegna or like any of those like major corporations, right? So I have suspicions and I've heard things about what happens in those newsrooms, but I just want to be clear that I'm only talking about the ones from my experience. Disclaimer. Okay. I think that, like I said before, I think there's a marked difference in the attitude of folks that are working for a nonprofit newsroom versus a for-profit newsroom. One, there's like not much ego in nonprofit news. Like you're not going to get much individually. Two, the pay is also not very high. So it's like in a similar way to like social work or something. It's like people who are dedicated to it because they're not necessarily going to be getting a bigger paycheck. But I also think it makes a difference in terms of the actual things that we cover, right? And this is like really the heart of the issue for us, for the three of us, and like for a lot of people that run or believe in nonprofit news, is that your coverage can be dictated based on, and often is for a lot of news organizations, is dictated based on what is going to get views and what is going to get clicks. And human nature, by and large, doesn't necessarily always gravitate toward the things that we need, but rather a lot of times the things that we want, or the things that we want to see, or the things that we want to read and consume. And so when we only cater to that, like newsrooms are only feeding people junk, right? Like they're only feeding them the snacks and the chocolate bars and the things like that, and not giving them the things that that a lot of times like they need for their life. And that's not to say that folks won't read like longer, like more pressing investigations or more in depth, like or pressing issues about their day-to-day life, or things that might be a little drier, a little bit more in the weeds. I think people will if it's presented well. But with the traditional news model, it's usually been very cut and dry, and people just weren't reading that. And so with the internet age, it became, and this happened a little bit with broadcast even before this, like for those of you who like may not be aware of what the kind of inner workings of local broadcast news is, the way that the advertisers are set up for broadcast news is they have sweeps once a year, where people come in and they look at what are your audience numbers during this time. And then from that, we'll be able to figure out what your advertiser rate will be, right? So like your audience is this size, that's what you'll use to tell advertisers, like, you should pay us this much money because our audience is this size. What that means is almost every broadcast station throughout the country then caters their content to have their hardest hitting stories, their sexiest stories, the stories that are going to get the most views during those sweeps, right? Because that's what ends up giving them the better views, so that gets them the more advertiser dollars. Even in my own personal experience, I've seen this kind of trickle down. So like I said, that's what I've heard from other folks who have worked in the broadcast industry. I haven't worked in the broadcast industry. I have worked for a lot of online media, which is very dictated by clicks. In one of my past jobs, I actually, and this was what ended up making me want to leave the job. I actually was working on reporting kind of general news things, which included some pop culture things as well as general news, for a bit of an aggregate site, for a national media aggregate site. And I pitched a story. So first of all, in a 6-hour shift, I was expected to write 6 to 8 stories. First of all, just for like the level of production that I had, which meant I couldn't verify things. I couldn't get original sources, original quoting. Like, it had to be aggregate content or I wouldn't have met my deadlines. 1, 2, I pitched a story that was about a woman who had been abused by Chris Brown, or had brought allegations of abuse against Chris Brown forth. I do want to add a little bit of a content warning. I'm not going to get into anything too messy, just for anyone that's listening. I just want to give a little bit of an abuse content warning. I pitched it to my editor saying, like, here's a person who is like famously like been accused of abuse, and like a lot of folks really believe that he is like committed this abuse against Rihanna. Like, I think it'd be really important and telling to like tell the story, right? And this is a publication that's like specifically focused on women. I pitched the story and was like, I think this would be really important. And she told me, it's not Rihanna that was getting abused, so I don't think people are going to care enough. We need to go on to the next story. And completely like wrote the pitch off because it wasn't like a big enough celebrity that was being abused. And so like there wasn't going to be the clickbait headline with the celebrity that you were going to recognize. So it probably wasn't going to get as much views, which means it just didn't get covered by this like national publication that a lot of young women read, that a lot of young women read for their news sources, or for one of their news sources. So I think that is just one of a million examples, right, that happen in the industry from a for-profit side. And I don't even blame my editor. I don't even blame the company. I blame the for-profit model. The for-profit model means that you are deciding things from top to bottom based on your clicks and based on how many people are actually going to view the website, and not necessarily what the most important stories to be told are.
Wow, that is quite an experience to have, like, in a position, and to have to kind of confront those issues, like, morally, in your career. And I think that is an issue that a lot of journalists probably run into. And, at the end of the day, you have deadlines and quotas to fill. And I think a lot of people probably find it difficult to step out of that and say, hey, that culture that's created there, you have to get it done. It's about getting the work done and like getting that information out there, and to that extent. And sometimes there's not time or room or space given in these institutions, in these kind of corporate structures, for journalists to even feel comfortable bringing about those moral issues, and I think that is another kind of issue that you can see, is that there's just not the time. It's just this 24-hour news cycle, and we have to respond and react, and also try to be proactive. But also in those moments, where does that leave room for any of these ethical questions that I think journalism really does need to reckon with, and come to terms with and explore, and I think the more transparent the journalism industry can be about that, the better, because it's a learning industry. It's several hundred years old, and it still operates on some of its, very old principles. And in some ways that's really, really good. And in other ways that's, we've got to rethink that, and I think this is kind of where some of that starts.
Some would say we need to evolve.
Yeah, so with that, and I know we've kind of touched on that. Speaking of the evolution, Matter News is a fiscally sponsored nonprofit. So can you explain a little bit more about our funding model, our kind of specific approach, and why we chose this business model?
Absolutely. I am dying to know why Cassie just made that face. But yes, so Matter is if you want to jump in, Cass, I want to let you have the floor because I feel like I've been taking up a bit of it. But Matter is a fiscally sponsored nonprofit. We talked a little bit about why we chose the nonprofit status before. And I will say we're only fiscally sponsored right now because we are pending for our nonprofit application, which Cass could definitely talk a little bit more about. But yeah, Cass, if you have anything else, take it away.
I kicked the switch under me, which turned off my lights. So that was why I made that face, because I thought I lost power for a second, but I was like, everything else is good.
Oh my gosh. It looked perfectly timed out to Marissa being like, explain your business model. And you were like, oh.
Oh my God. No. And it's totally okay. This episode, I think it's fitting for you to be having a little bit more of the floor in a lot of these episodes, just because you really have the most experience from inside the industry. So that's some of the most valuable stuff here. Anyway, so yeah, fiscal sponsorship. I am, we're really fortunate that through Jay's experience, having worked for nonprofit news outlets in the past, that she was really familiar with the Institute for Nonprofit News, because if you do want to start a nonprofit news outlet, and we like to go into this sometimes for anyone that's watching, because we do have friends who are doing their own independent news, or people we really want to help inspire and equip other people to diversify the landscape here in news. So I'll just briefly explain that if you want to start a nonprofit news outlet like we did, it's often difficult, no matter what you're doing, to start a nonprofit and just found a nonprofit organization. You have to prove to the IRS that you are doing something worthy of, being able to process donations and process those without, taxes and things like that. So typically what's going to happen is you're going to have a fiscal sponsor. So what that means is we have the Institute for Nonprofit News, which was a natural, obvious fiscal sponsor for us and anyone that wants to get into nonprofit news, because they are the fiscal sponsor, and that's specifically one of their services for nonprofit news outlets like ours, who are younger, less established. Really, they have even more established news outlets than us that still are fiscally sponsored by them. So we chose to do that so that we could really work on applying for our own nonprofit status while being nonprofit from the jump. So it may get confusing because there's all these legal statuses, but what you need to know is Gray Matter Media, Matter News has operated as a nonprofit from the very beginning. We never intended to be for profit. And so from the very beginning, we've had that fiscal sponsorship with the Institute for Nonprofit News, which means we can accept donations through them. And those donations are tax deductible. So any, donation you make to us is tax deductible. And they kind of handle a lot of the legal stuff until we get our own nonprofit status. So it really helps that there's an organization like that that's specifically wanting to evolve the nonprofit news industry and has seen that need for people to have that sponsor. And the Institute for Nonprofit News does much more than just fiscally sponsor us. They're a professional organization for nonprofit news across the country, whether you're fiscally sponsored by them or not. And it's just been a huge benefit to have them and to have a fiscal sponsor who is so aligned, that has so many resources, and can really help a fledgling newsroom like ours get off the ground. Now, in terms of the nonprofit thing, there's just been, I think we've already talked about a lot of the benefits, so I won't go much into that, but I think there's just a lot more benefits than we kind of realized going for the nonprofit model in some ways, I think. Like I was saying earlier, the board, I didn't go too much into this, but our board, beyond just like making sure we stay in our mission, before I was talking about their kind of enforcement qualities that they're supposed to be kind of enforcing that we stay on our mission. But what a board does most of the time, they're usually, and especially we like to think we're very strategic and going along with our mission. Our board spends most of their time supporting us and supporting the mission. So we've been really fortunate that as a nonprofit, we've been, forced legally to assemble this board. Otherwise, I don't know if we would have. And for a community focused newsroom like ours, that's been huge, because that board actually helps us fundraise. It kind of broadens our horizons in terms of who we're networking with, what parts of the city we're touching, and how we're spreading our mission about. So the funding model that we chose, I think, has come with all kinds of benefits and different things that aren't necessarily tied directly to funding, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think one of those other benefits too that I was going to mention earlier, but I just want to slide in real fast here, is having to be nonpartisan. So for most people that are a news consumer, you're aware that like it's traditional for a lot of newspapers to choose and endorse a candidate during most major races, right? So you'll see like tons of national publications will come out and be like, New York Times endorsed so-and-so, LA Times endorsed so-and-so, like whatever, right? It's something that people have always done. Columbus Dispatch, I believe, still endorses people. I think so. I knew that was true for a couple of years ago, and I think it's still true now. That has always blown my mind. Like, I feel like we as a news industry and as journalists strive to be so objective all of the time, but then for one of the most direct ways that you could influence like decision making and policy and governance, we're like, hey, y'all, this is exactly what you should do. Like, it just blows my mind, and it seems like an overreach of the idea of objectivity. And as a nonprofit, we are legally barred from doing that. Like, we cannot be partisan as a nonprofit, which means we can never endorse a candidate. We can never lean too heavily on one side. We can never make it seem like we're leaning too heavily on one side. And I think that while conversations about objectivity are much longer, and I think we're going to get into that later in these Matter Mondays, I think that by and large, that does mean that we are staying at least nonpartisan, if nothing else.
Wow, that was fantastic. What a well and in-depth answer about our business model, and y'all keep schooling me on stuff even too. It's great. So that really concludes our programming for this evening. I don't think that I've seen any questions come through, but I'm not too sure about Instagram. So if anyone has eyes on IG,
I can take a look at Instagram in a second. The only thing is, and I don't want to extend us past like the expiration of the conversation, but did we get to talk a little bit more about like ownership?
I was going to say I could definitely touch on like ownership of different local media, specifically here in Columbus.
Just in case someone
hard deets,
because I think it feels like to us we've beat that. We've been talking about that a lot, but for people who might not have been tuned in like last week, getting an idea of, because we talked a little bit kind of broad strokes about who funds Columbus's news, but I think it might be interesting just for the people that might not know to talk a little bit more specifically before we log off.
Yeah, definitely. I can talk on that, and then if you guys want to just jump in.
That's dope. I was like, I don't mean to, like ask you to do that, but that would be awesome.
That's all right. I got it. I did all the digging. I got it. Okay, so Columbus's media landscape, like I said earlier, is primarily mainstream media. There are some independent press, and like even the folks I have on here as independent press aren't all of them. Like we talked about the Unbossed Network and Oracle and like Columbus Navigator's independent press. So there's a lot of things that have sprung up in Columbus recently that would fall into that category, which makes me very happy. But like Columbus Underground, 614, those are both independent for-profit media organizations. We talked a little bit about the nonprofit ones. So the ones that I'm going to mostly focus on right now are the corporate-owned for-profit news organizations here in Columbus. So the Dispatch, we love to talk about the Dispatch. So the Dispatch is owned by, I feel like I need a whiteboard up here to be like, News Funding 101. The Dispatch here in Columbus is it used to be owned by Dispatch Media Group, which was a locally owned group that included like Columbus CEO, Columbus Monthly, several other kind of news publications that were all under that same umbrella. That company got bought by Gatehouse initially, which was a company that was based out of New York, had tons of different newspapers throughout the country. And Gatehouse actually merged with what was at the time and now is certainly the largest newspaper holder in the country, Gannett. Gannett also owns the Cincinnati Enquirer as well as USA Today. That's why the Dispatch's website now looks like all of those other ones, is because now they are owned by Gannett. So Gatehouse and Gannett actually merged under an entirely different corporation name called New Media Investment Group. If you try to figure out which company actually owns the Dispatch, you're going to go down a rabbit hole of corporate structure where one company owns another one. And I think I ended up in like 3 different countries. So that's who owns the Dispatch. In total, Gatehouse, Gannett, and I think they go by, I think they primarily go by Gatehouse now, but the New Media Investment Group, that's kind of, is it the other way? versus Face the
Yeah,
News.
Gannett, like the Gannett papers. Yeah.
Gotcha. I couldn't remember which title, which like company they adopted.
Well, like Gatehouse is like the overall owner, but Gannett is the name that they go by, I believe is how it is. But it's also very convoluted. That was my understanding of it. But maybe
it's almost like they're trying to confuse us about who owns all of this news.
That's corporate structure to a T, I feel like. Well, I'm going to go with New Media Investment Group because that's the parent company for all of them. From what I could find, they own 263 newspapers throughout the country. They are the single largest owner of newspapers throughout the country. There are certain things that because of that, they end up consolidating. And from what it sounds like, it doesn't sound like the Dispatch has changed their editorial coverage a ton, but I don't think that we would necessarily see those effects until they trickle down a little bit farther out than what we are now. Columbus Business First is also not locally owned. It's owned by a corporation called American City Business Journals. They're in 44 different publications in at least 30 states. Very similar to Columbus Business First, very similar structure, only focused on business reporting and things revolving around business, right? So like new apartments, new developments, cost of construction. I feel like that's a lot of what I see here, but different cities cover different things related to the business community. So I found the stat the other day that NBC4, which is WCMH, is their like I can't remember the word for it. Their like tag or call thing. I can't remember the word for it right now, but so NBC4, they are actually the large, like they're the broadcast station. I think the main news source that most people in Columbus will focus on. So at least out of all of the local TV broadcast stations, NBC4 has more people reporting that's where they get most of their news from, according to Pew Research, like we mentioned earlier. The company that owns them is Nexstar. So Nexstar, and the other one I'm going to mention, Sinclair, which is what owns ABC6, which is WSYX. Those two each own almost 200 broadcast stations throughout the country. And from what I was trying to find in terms of like market share, because the broadcast is based on individual markets, I think that's about 40% each of the market share. So between the two of them, they own like a vast majority of the local broadcast markets, right? Nexstar does, I will say, they do address in their website as well as in some of their communications about kind of what kind of company culture they want to have and things like that. They do address certain social responsibility measures that as a corporation, I think a lot of people would believe need to be addressed. So for example, environmental impact, how to have diversity, equity, and inclusion, like things like that within their corporate structure. They do address that. Not shockingly to me, maybe shockingly to some other people, a lot of these companies don't. Like out of all of the companies I'm going to mention on the list of kind of mainstream media in Columbus, Nexstar and Tegna are the only two that talk about social responsibility as a corporation at all. And I will say Nexstar does very heavily talk about their involvement in the community and what their dedication looks like in terms of their involvement in the community. I think it's important to say that, like, you know, having some copy on your website saying that you're involved in the community is not the same as actually being involved in the community, but it does show that they at least are valuing that and that they're marking that as a priority. So again, that's who owns NBC4. ABC6 is actually owned by Sinclair, which I know Cassie will recognize that name, if not both of you. Sinclair got in a lot of hot water a few years ago. I can't remember when it was exactly. I want to say 2015 or 2016, but they got in a lot of hot water a few years ago because they, from the top down, gave not just editorial direction, but an exact script that they, I believe, made mandatory for folks that were doing on-air commentary. So, excuse me, this wasn't for regular news broadcasting. It wasn't like it was somebody reporting on a story, but it was somebody giving like a bit of an opinion statement that was supposed to be a local person in all of these markets that were being fed the exact same lines. So hopefully we can drop in the feed a link that I actually have from a John Oliver clip where they kind of splice all of that together. But essentially they, like I said, verbatim to the exact same lines, to the point that in 2019, a study from the American Political Science Review found that, and I'm going to read this verbatim so y'all get this exactly, that Sinclair, quote, stations bought by Sinclair reduce coverage of local politics, increase national coverage, and move the ideological tone of coverage in a conservative direction relative to other stations operating in the same market. And I think that's fascinating, especially because this is an ABC station. Like they're an ABC affiliate, but owned by Sinclair. And I think people have this like idea of Fox as being like the conservative channel, right? For not just like the main Fox News National, but also for like Fox affiliates. But that's not necessarily true. Like corporate overseeing of these local stations and local newspapers can dictate the ideological direction of it, even outside of what you're seeing for national news, right? Like it's so much more in the background and more insidious than just being like, oh, Fox, that's a conservative channel. So I thought that was really fascinating. 10 TV is owned by Tegna, which actually used to be part of Gannett as well. They did the opposite of what most media organizations are doing these days, which is they spun off of Gannett in 2015, are now their own company. But they also address some social responsibility things in terms of like how they handle themselves as a corporation. And they, compared to the other two, which own 200 stations apiece, they own 66 stations, which like I said, spun off from Gannett. So much smaller company, very like, but definitely focused on like social responsibility a bit more, like I mentioned. So a little bit different than the other two, but still like a bit of a heavyweight player. And then the very bottom of the list, WTTE or Fox 28 is owned by what's called Cunningham Broadcasting, which I had to do some digging into this because I've never heard of this company, probably because they own 15 stations, most of which are Fox stations in various markets that are very similar in size to Columbus. They seemed pretty run-of-the-mill, like broadcast corporate media conglomerate, but not as big, not nearly as big, and definitely not owning 40% of the market share. So that's kind of like a basic rundown, both for you guys and for our audience at home, of kind of who, like what the specific companies are that own these for-profit mainstream media organizations, and the stuff that they're getting into, the kind of things that they value and the things that they don't in some cases.
Oh, sorry. Did you have
Go
something?
ahead.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
Wow. Well, that is quite the entourage of information, and like so many. What's so interesting is that so much of what we see looks diverse, and what always meets the eye isn't always what is really there. And so I appreciate you, Jalen, for doing that background research, and bringing to light, who really owns the media that we're consuming in Columbus, and how that media is funded. And thank you to both of you for explaining, the impacts on the news that's produced and the impacts on the community here. I think both of you wonderfully said this. And thank you all so much for tuning in. And while we're talking about funding local news, I'd be remiss to say, if this is another one of our fundraising events. And if you are tuning in, we are a small nonprofit, independent community newsroom, and every last penny truly helps support us in fulfilling our mission of bringing sustainable and equitable community engagement to, our big community here in Central Ohio. And we're striving to do that. We're striving to be where we can and meet you all where we're at. We do have a $5 suggested donation for this event. If you're, willing and able, we understand times have definitely been tough. We totally get it. So if you can, that would be great. Our donation page is at matternews.org/donate. If you're on Twitch, you should be able to donate through Twitch. But yes, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate all of you for tuning in. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Cass.
I just want to mention that I think we may have had it wrong earlier, that the study we were talking about with the funding and the different age groups is from Knight Gallup, and I put the link in most of our feeds. So check Twitch and especially YouTube, and I'll make sure to add it to Facebook for if you're interested in digging down into that study that we were talking a lot about.
Appreciate that quick fact check, Cal.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate
I almost forgot.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. We hope to see you next week on Monday, the 30th. Also happens to be my birthday. Where we'll talk about in the newsroom. So make sure to tune in for that. And we appreciate you all for tuning in. So thank you.
Have a good night, y'all.
Thank you all. Bye.